are the quarterbacks you want in your lineup for Week 10? Well, SI's fantasy analyst Michael Fabiano is here with that insight. Fabs, which QBs should fantasy managers start this week?
Yeah, how good was Tua Tagovailoa last week, right? In his first NFL start, he had 93 yards, and I kind of feel like he scared a lot of fantasy fans. But last week, 20 plus points against the Cardinals, and he's got a really good matchup this week against the Chargers. They've allowed 16 touchdown passes and the fourth most fantasy points to quarterbacks, and 5 QBs have scored 19 plus fantasy points against Los Angeles. So Tua versus Herbert in a matchup of very good young quarterbacks. Both are very startable this week. And then Ben Roethlisberger. Now, first off, he's on the COVID list right now. Okay, so keep tabs on his status. Matthew Stafford was on the COVID list last week for Detroit, and he ended up starting. So if Big Ben is a go for the Steelers, he's a go for your fantasy football team. The Bengals have allowed 20 plus fantasy points to 4 quarterbacks this season, including Baker Mayfield, Phillip Rivers, and Gardner Minshew. Folks, those are not elite quarterbacks. So if Big Ben is a go, you should start him in Week 10.
Fingers crossed on Big Ben, Fabs. I'm hopeful. But 2 more quarterbacks that you like are Justin Herbert versus the Dolphins and Jared Goff versus the Seahawks. All right, let's talk about the QBs that fantasy managers should stay away from.
So Cam Newton is coming off a huge game. But you know what, Kaitlin? It was the Jets. The Jets just aren't a good football team. Now he's got the Ravens, and they have allowed an average of fewer than 18 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. And that is a formidable defense considering how many points quarterbacks are scoring this year. And the Ravens are also tough against the run. And that's where Cam Newton has most of his value from a fantasy perspective. So I would fade Cam this week. And then Joe Burrow, we're talking about good young quarterbacks, right? I mean, he's one of the best in the National Football League. He's given you 18 plus fantasy points with 5 touchdowns in his last 2 games. Here's the problem. He's got a matchup at the big catch-up model there in Pittsburgh against the Steelers. They've allowed just 14 touchdown passes, the 5th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, and just 1 quarterback has scored more than 18 fantasy points against them this season. And surprisingly, that was Jeff Driscoll. But Joe Burrow is a fade for me this week.
All right, well, other QBs to avoid this week on Fab's sit-em list are Kirk Cousins and Daniel Jones. Fabs, thanks so much for your insight. For more insight and Sports Illustrated's award-winning weekly player rankings, get your membership to SI Fantasy Plus for just $14.99 a month.